All right, strap in everyone because we're diving headfirst into the murky waters of Canadian internet regulation. Now, I know what you're thinking. Canadian internet regulation? That sounds about as exciting as watching paint dry on a moose. And you'd be right if it weren't for the fact that this particular piece of legislation, Bill C-63, also known as the Online Harms Act, has the potential to be more damaging than a beaver let loose in a maple syrup factory. This bill, my friends, is a real doozy. It's ostensibly designed to protect Canadians from the very real harms that exist online. Things like hate speech, child exploitation and terrorism, all very noble goals, to be sure. However, as with any well-intentioned government initiative, the devil is in the details, and let me tell you, these details are hairier than a Sasquatch on a bad hair day. We're talking vague definitions, potential overreach, privacy concerns, the whole shebang. This isn't just some esoteric legal mumbo-jumbo either. This bill could have a very real impact on what Canadians see and say online. So buckle up, Buttercup, because we're about to unpack this legislative nightmare one alarming clause at a time. Let's start with the most glaring issue, shall we? The bill's definition of harmful content is about as clear as a glass of glacier water after a polar bear swim. We're talking content that could cause significant emotional distress. Now, I don't know about you, but my emotional state is a fickle beast. One minute I'm laughing at a cat video, the next I'm weeping over a particularly poignant commercial for laundry detergent. Where do we draw the line? Who gets to decide what constitutes significant emotional distress? Because let me tell you, the last thing I want is some government bureaucrat, likely with the emotional range of a stale Timbit, deciding what I can and cannot handle on the internet. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, folks. The bill also targets content that incites violence, which, again, sounds reasonable on the surface. But what about a passionate speech that criticizes the government? Could that be construed as inciting violence in the eyes of some overzealous regulator? This vagueness is incredibly dangerous. It creates a chilling effect on free speech where people self-censor for fear of running afoul of these nebulous rules. It's like trying to have a conversation in a library while wearing a suit of armor. You might technically be allowed to speak, but the sheer awkwardness of it all makes you want to stay silent. And let's not forget about the potential for bias in content moderation. Who gets to decide what's harmful? Whose values and perspectives will be reflected in these decisions? These are crucial questions that the bill conveniently fails to address. So what we're left with is a system ripe for abuse, where legitimate speech is stifled, and the internet becomes less a forum for open dialogue and more like a carefully curated, government-approved pamphlet. And frankly, that's about as appealing as a plate of poutine left out in the Canadian winter. Now, let's talk about everyone's favourite topic, privacy. Because if there's one thing Canadians hold dearer than their maple syrup, it's their right to privacy. Or at least it used to be, until Bill C-63 came along like a moose on a rampage. You see, this bill mandates that online platforms retain user data and disclose it to law enforcement without a warrant. That's right, folks. They're essentially handing the keys to our digital lives over to the government and saying, "Here you go, have a look around, don't mind the mess." Now, I understand the need to investigate legitimate crimes, but this kind of sweeping data retention is like using a fishing trawler to catch a goldfish. You're bound to scoop up a whole lot of innocent bystanders in the process, and let's not forget the chilling effect this has on anonymous speech. Anonymity is crucial for whistleblowers, activists, and anyone else who needs to express dissenting opinions without fear of reprisal. But with this bill in place, that anonymity is gone. It's like trying to have a confidential conversation in a crowded Tim Hortons. Good luck finding any privacy there. The government argues that these measures are necessary to combat online harms. But at what cost? Are we willing to sacrifice our fundamental right to privacy in the name of security? Because to me, that sounds like a classic case of cutting off your nose to spite your face. And trust me, nobody wants to see that, especially not after a long Canadian winter. Now, you might be thinking, okay, John, but surely these regulations only apply to the big tech giants, right? The Facebooks and Googles of the world. Well, my friend, you would be tragically, hilariously wrong. You see, Bill C-63 casts a wide net, so wide that it could probably catch a whole school of Newfoundland cod. We're talking about small businesses, startups, even individual bloggers. Anyone who operates a website or online platform could be caught in its crosshairs. And let's be real, complying with these regulations is no walk in the park. It requires significant resources, technical expertise, and legal counsel. Resources that small businesses and startups simply don't have. It's like asking a local bakery to compete with a multinational corporation like Dunkin'. Sure, they both make donuts, but one has a distinct advantage in terms of scale and resources. So, what happens when these smaller platforms can't keep up? They either shut down entirely or more likely get swallowed up by the big fish in the pond. And what does that mean for us? the users. Less choice, less diversity of opinion, and a whole lot more power concentrated in the hands of a few tech giants. Which, let's be honest, is about as appealing as a plate of Kraft dinner without the cheese powder. Rules are made to be ignored. Now let's talk about enforcement, shall we? Because passing a law is one thing, but actually enforcing it is a whole other kettle of fish, especially when it comes to the internet. Think of it like this. Trying to enforce Canadian law on the internet is like trying to herd cats while riding a unicycle on a sheet of ice. It's chaotic, it's messy, and it's probably not going to end well. The internet, by its very nature, is global and decentralized. Trying to compel foreign companies to comply with Canadian regulations is like trying to get a beaver to wear a tuxedo. It might be amusing to watch, but it's ultimately futile. And what happens when you try to regulate something as fluid and dynamic as the internet? Well, those pesky, harmful actors, they don't just pack up and go home. They're like cockroaches in a cheap motel. You might get rid of a few, but they'll always find new cracks to crawl out of. They'll simply migrate to darker corners of the web, to platforms that are beyond the reach of Canadian law. So what we're left with is a system that's not only ineffective, but potentially counterproductive. We're driving harmful content underground, making it harder to track and combat. It's like trying to put out a forest fire with a squirt gun. You're just making things worse. Power up! The rise of the digital czars. Now, let's talk about who gets to hold all the power under this new law. And spoiler alert, it's not the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Instead, Bill C-63 proposes the creation of a new regulatory body, the Digital Safety Commission. Now, on the surface, this might sound like a good idea. After all, who doesn't love a good commission? But here's the catch. This commission is granted sweeping powers to regulate online content with very little oversight. We're talking about the power to block websites, order the removal of content, and even impose hefty fines on platforms that don't comply. It's like giving the librarian the power to not only shush you, but also to confiscate your books and fine you for overdue library cards. And who gets to appoint the members of this all-powerful commission? You guessed it, the government. So, essentially, we're handing over control of our online lives to a group of unelected bureaucrats with the power to censor content they deem harmful. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds about as comforting as a moose charging at me while I'm wearing a bacon suit. It's a recipe for disaster, folks, and one that could have serious implications for freedom of expression in Canada. The sound of innovation. Crickets. Now, let's talk about the future, shall we? Because Bill C-63 isn't just a threat to the internet as we know it today, it's a threat to the internet of tomorrow. Imagine this, you're a young entrepreneur with a brilliant idea for a new social media platform. It's innovative, it's exciting, it's going to revolutionize the way we connect online. But there's just one problem. You live in Canada, and Bill C-63 is now the law of the land. You realize that launching your platform in this regulatory environment is like trying to start a campfire in a hurricane. It's not impossible, but it's going to be incredibly difficult and probably a little bit dangerous. The compliance costs alone are enough to make you want to pack it all in and open a maple syrup farm instead. And then there's the constant threat of fines, lawsuits, and even criminal charges if you accidentally run afoul of the law's vague and overly broad provisions. So what do? You take your brilliant idea and you go elsewhere. You go to a country where innovation isn't stifled by overreaching regulations and where the government isn't breathing down your neck every time you hit the publish button. And just like that, Canada loses out on the next big thing. We become a digital backwater. A cautionary tale of what happens when you try to regulate the internet into submission. And that, my friends, is a future as bleak as a Canadian winter without a warm cup of Tim Hortons coffee. Not on my watch, a chorus of dissent. Now you might be thinking, John, this all sounds pretty dire. Surely someone's saying something about this, right? Well, hold on to your toques, folks. Because you're about to witness a Canadian standoff of epic proportions. On one side, we have the usual suspects. Civil liberties groups, digital rights advocates, and even some internet law experts. They're waving their arms, pulling their hair out, and generally raising a ruckus about the bill's potential to erode fundamental freedoms. They're like a pack of beavers trying to warn everyone about an impending dam collapse. They're working tirelessly, but nobody seems to be listening. On the other side, we have the government standing firm in its conviction that this bill is necessary to protect Canadians from online harm. They argue that the internet is a dangerous place full of trolls, bullies, and other unsavory characters, and that something needs to be done to rein in the wild west of the web. Caught in the middle of the tech companies themselves, they're like moose caught in headlights, unsure of which way to turn. On the one hand, they don't want to be seen as complicit in online harms. On the other hand, They're understandably wary of any regulations that could stifle innovation and harm their bottom line. It's a classic case of damned if you do, damned if you don't. And as this battle rages on, one thing is clear: the stakes couldn't be higher. The future of the internet, and indeed the future of free expression in Canada, hangs in the balance. The law of unintended consequences, it's a thing. Now let's talk about the unintended consequences, shall we? Because as any seasoned Canadian politician will tell you, when it comes to government intervention, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You see, while Bill C-63 might seem like a good idea on paper, the reality is far more complex. Like a game of pond hockey on a frozen lake, things can change quickly, and the outcome is rarely predictable. For example, let's say the government succeeds in cracking down on hate speech on mainstream platforms. Sounds great, right? Well, not so fast. What happens to all that hate speech? Does it magically disappear? Of course not. It simply migrates to less regulated spaces, to the dark corners of the internet, where it becomes even harder to track and combat. It's like trying to get rid of mosquitoes by draining a swamp. You might eliminate the breeding ground in one location, but they'll simply find another. And then there's the issue of selective enforcement. Who gets to decide what constitutes harmful content? Whose values and perspectives will be reflected in these decisions? Because let's not kid ourselves, any system that gives the government the power to censor online content is ripe for abuse. What starts as a well-intentioned effort to protect Canadians from hate speech could easily morph into a tool for silencing dissent and suppressing minority voices. And that, my friends, is a slippery slope we do not want to go down. The future of the internet, choose wisely. So there you have it, folks, the dark side of Bill C-63. It's a bill that's long on good intentions, but woefully short on common sense. It's a bill that threatens to turn the internet, a place of boundless potential and free expression, into a carefully curated and heavily censored echo chamber. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be having a conversation about online harms. Of course we should. But this bill, in its current form, is not the answer. It's a sledgehammer where a scalpel is needed. A blunt instrument that risks causing more harm than good. The future of the internet, and indeed the future of free expression in Canada, hangs in the balance. It's time for Canadians to stand up, make their voices heard, and demand better. Because the internet, for all its flaws, is still a powerful tool for communication, connection, and change. Let's not let it slip away.